Hollywood loves a hero story, but it loves a downfall story even more, especially when that downfall isn't loud, explosive, or dramatic, but slow, uncomfortable, and hiding in plain sight. This is one of those stories. A story about power, perception, and what happens when charm stops working. For years, his face was everywhere. Late-night television, blockbuster movies, award shows, red carpets, viral clips, smiling selfies with A-list celebrities. He wasn't just present, he was unavoidable. And yet, behind that polished image, something else was forming. A reputation that followed him into rooms before he ever walked in. A reputation whispered about on sets, shared between crew members, joked about nervously by people who had dealt with him directly. And over time, that reputation grew louder than the applause. What makes this story fascinating isn't just the number of people who claim to have had bad experiences. It's how consistent those claims are. Different countries, different years, different jobs, different levels of power. And yet, the same descriptions kept surfacing. Rude, dismissive, cruel, arrogant, entitled. Words that don't appear once or twice, but again and again, until they start forming a pattern that's impossible to ignore. And the most important part? This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about bitterness. It wasn't even about talent. The criticism wasn't focused on whether he deserved success. It was focused on how he behaved once he had it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back long before the fame, long before the spotlight, long before America ever knew his name. He was born in the late 1970s, raised in a solidly middle-class environment in England, far from Hollywood glamour. There was no silver spoon, no dynasty, no industry connections waiting to be activated. By most accounts, it was a normal upbringing. But even then, certain traits stood out. He was loud. He was confident. He demanded attention. Teachers noticed it. Classmates noticed it. And depending on who you ask, it was either charisma in its early stages or the beginning of something more complicated. Confidence can be magnetic, especially in entertainment. But confidence without self-awareness has a way of mutating. Early on, his career moved steadily but modestly. Small television appearances, stage work, guest roles. Nothing that screamed superstardom, but enough to create momentum. Each role led to another. Each opportunity reinforced the idea that this path was meant for him. And somewhere along the line, according to many people who crossed paths with him, the hunger turned into expectation. The gratitude turned into entitlement. The excitement turned into ego. Then came the moment that changed everything. A television show that would become more than a hit, more than a success, more than just another comedy. It became a cultural reference point, a show people quoted endlessly, a show families watched together, a show that embedded itself into the national conversation. Overnight, he wasn't just an actor anymore. He was a name, a face, a personality, someone people recognized on the street, someone whose voice carried weight. And with that recognition came power. The power to influence a set, the power to shape an environment, the power to decide how people around you feel at work. This is where the story quietly starts to change. Because while audiences fell in love with the character on screen, behind the scenes, a different image was forming. An image built not on one incident, but on atmosphere, on tension, on the way rooms felt when he entered them, on the way people adjusted their behavior around him. Success opened doors beyond his home country. Soon, Hollywood took notice. And when Hollywood decides it likes you, it doesn't test the waters. It dives in head first. Suddenly, he was everywhere. Films, voice roles, franchises, high-profile projects stacked one after another. Each appearance reinforced the same question whispered by audiences and industry insiders alike. How did he become this ubiquitous, this fast, this powerful? But that question was quickly drowned out by visibility. Because visibility has a way of silencing doubt. If someone is everywhere, people assume they must belong there. At the same time, something else was happening. Stories began to circulate. Not headlines, not exposés, just stories. Shared quietly, repeated casually. I worked with him once. I served him. I was on that set. Always the same tone. Always the same discomfort. Always the same ending. And yet, nothing stuck. Because fame has a protective layer. And for a long time, that layer held. Then came late-night television, a seed of immense influence, a platform that turns personalities into institutions. Night after night, he appeared in millions of homes, smiling, joking, singing, laughing with celebrities, creating moments designed to go viral. And on the surface, it worked. But beneath it, cracks were forming. Not in ratings, not in branding, but in loyalty, in morale, in trust. This is the point where everything becomes far more complicated. Because once someone reaches this level, their behavior doesn't just affect themselves. It affects writers, crew members, assistants, technicians, people whose names never appear on screen, but whose labor makes everything possible. And when those people start talking, even quietly, the story changes tone. It stops being gossip and starts becoming something heavier. By now, you might feel like you know where this is going. That's exactly what I want you to think. Because the truth is, we've barely scratched the surface. The most uncomfortable moments haven't happened yet. The most revealing details are still ahead. And the part that makes this story impossible to look away from isn't what he did when everyone was watching. It's what happened when he thought no one important was. So stay with me. Do not skip ahead. And as we move forward, pay attention to how often the same themes repeat themselves, because repetition is never accidental. At the end of this video, I want you to do 3 things. First, comment the exact moment you realized this story was bigger than you expected. Second, leave your theory on whether fame exposed behavior that was always there or created it. And third, if you want more deep dives like this, type the word hype in the comments so I know to keep going. This story isn't about one man. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked for too long. And we're only just beginning. As his presence in Hollywood solidified, something subtle but important began to shift. The applause was still there, the invitations kept coming, the projects kept stacking up. But behind the curtain the mood was changing. In an industry built on image, perception is everything, and perception is rarely shaped by one moment. It is shaped by accumulation, by patterns, by how often the same complaints surface from people who have nothing to gain by speaking up and everything to lose by being honest. And this is where the whispers started turning into murmurs. People who worked close to him began describing an environment that felt tense rather than collaborative. Not explosive, not dramatic in a way that made headlines, but draining. The kind of tension that settles into a room and never quite leaves. The kind where people lower their voices, choose their words carefully, and brace themselves for unpredictable reactions. According to those accounts, it wasn't just about bad days or stress. It was about a consistent hierarchy, one where respect flowed only in one direction. The problem with power is that it magnifies personality. When someone kind gains authority, they often become kinder. When someone insecure gains authority, they often become controlling. And when someone arrogant gains authority, they become untouchable. That's what makes this next phase of the story so unsettling. Because the allegations didn't come from rivals or tabloids chasing clicks. They came from staff, from writers, from people whose job was to make everything run smoothly while remaining invisible to the audience. Behind the scenes of late-night television, the pace is brutal. Long hours, tight deadlines, constant pressure to produce. Morale matters more than people realize, because without it, even the most successful show starts bleeding from the inside. This is where the conversation shifted from personality to principle. Claims emerged about low pay, about cost-cutting that affected the people doing the most work, about decisions that allegedly prioritized the star at the center, while everyone else was expected to accept less and say nothing. What made these stories particularly uncomfortable was the contrast. On screen, he played the role of the warm, self-aware entertainer, the approachable host, the guy who laughs at himself. But off-screen, according to multiple accounts, the dynamic felt very different. Requests allegedly went unanswered. Credit allegedly went unshared. And when frustration surfaced, they didn't travel upward. They stayed bottled up, shared quietly between co-workers who knew how risky it was to complain. Then there was the money conversation. Few topics sour a reputation faster than perceived greed, especially in an industry where most people are underpaid, overworked, and easily replaceable. Allegations circulated that while the show itself struggled financially, pressure was still being applied from the top for higher personal compensation. Whether every detail is accurate or not almost becomes irrelevant, because the damage comes from how believable the story feels. And for many people watching from the outside, it felt very believable. At the same time, the internet began doing what it does best, remembering everything. Old clips resurfaced. Awkward moments that once seemed harmless were rewatched through a different lens. Interactions that were brushed off as jokes suddenly felt sharper, colder. Moments where someone else looked uncomfortable became harder to ignore. And when public opinion starts to tilt, even slightly, gravity does the rest of the work. Then came the controversy that pushed things further into the mainstream conversation. Accusations of joke theft. In comedy, this is sacred ground. One of the fastest ways to lose respect among peers. The moment people began drawing comparisons between monologues and existing material, the narrative shifted again. Because this wasn't about taste or humor anymore. It was about authenticity. About whether the image being presented was real or manufactured. Once those accusations surfaced, people started looking back. And looking back is dangerous. Patterns were identified. Compilations were made. Side-by-side comparisons circulated. And suddenly, a reputation that had once been protected by charm and visibility was being questioned openly. Not by gossip blogs alone, but by audiences who felt disappointed, even betrayed. Because when someone's brand is built on likability, the fall is steeper. And just when it seemed like the scrutiny couldn't intensify, another moment resurfaced that many found impossible to defend. A high-profile charity event. A room filled with powerful people. A moment in history when the entertainment industry was reckoning with its darkest secrets. And in that moment, jokes were made that many felt should never have been made at all. The backlash wasn't subtle. It was visceral. Because timing matters. Context matters. And empathy matters most of all. For some viewers, this was the turning point. Not because it was the worst thing ever done, but because it crystallized a pattern of tone deafness, of misreading the room, of prioritizing attention over awareness. And once again, the apology cycle followed. Statements, interviews, carefully chosen words, acknowledgments that felt rehearsed rather than reflective. For critics, it was too little, too late. For supporters, it was proof of growth, and the divide only widened. Meanwhile, his workload began to change. Fewer appearances, more voice roles, less visibility. Projects came and went without the same fanfare. To some, it looked like a deliberate step back. To others, it looked like quiet distancing. Hollywood rarely announces when it loses interest in someone. It simply stops calling as often. The invitations thin out. The momentum fades. And the person who once felt unavoidable slowly becomes optional. This is where the idea of image rehabilitation enters the conversation. Because when a reputation starts to crack, the response is rarely silence. It's management, damage control, narrative adjustment, the shift from denial to reflection, from defense to redemption. The public language changes. The interviews soften. The emphasis moves from success to growth, from power to humility. Whether sincere or strategic, the effort becomes visible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Once too many people share the same negative experience, no amount of rebranding can erase it completely. Because those stories don't live in headlines. They live in memory, in group chats, in break rooms, in conversations that never make it online. And those are the stories that decide whether someone is welcomed back with open arms or tolerated at a distance. We are now at the point in this story where the question is no longer what happened, but what it all means. Was this a case of fame amplifying flaws that were always there? Or did the system itself create the behavior by rewarding it over and over again? Was the charm real at first, or was it always a mask that eventually slipped? And perhaps most importantly, does the industry actually care? Or does it only care when the audience does? Before we move into the final part, I want you to pause for a moment. Think about everything you've heard so far. Not the rumors individually, but the shape they form together. Because in the last part, we're going to confront the most revealing details of all. The ones that don't rely on second-hand accounts or anonymous whispers, but on moments that happened in plain sight. If reputation is built on how you treat people when cameras are off, then moments of unfiltered reality are the most revealing currency of all. And this is where the story becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Because beyond anecdotes and allegations, there are moments that exist on record. Moments where behavior wasn't reported secondhand, but observed directly. Moments where there was no script, no preparation, no time to smooth out the edges. One such moment, often cited by critics, seems almost insignificant at first glance. A game. A segment meant to be lighthearted. A situation designed for laughs. And yet, when asked to do something astonishingly simple, something most people could do without thinking, the response was telling. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Indifference. The inability to name the people who worked closest with him every single day. The people who made his job possible. The people whose faces he saw constantly. For many viewers, that was the moment the image collapsed. Because it wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It was worse. It was dismissive. And in a strange way, it confirmed everything people had been saying for years. Not through words, but through absence. The absence of connection. The absence of awareness. The absence of care. In workplaces where leadership knows names, morale thrives. In workplaces where leadership does not, resentment grows. And entertainment sets are no different. In fact, they are more sensitive because the imbalance of power is so extreme. When someone at the top doesn't see you, you feel it. And according to countless stories shared online over the years, many people felt exactly that. As more of these moments accumulated, the internet responded the way it always does. Threads multiplied. Stories poured in. From servers. From assistants. From production staff. From people who had no reason to lie and no benefit to exaggerate. Individually, any one of these stories could be dismissed. Together, they form something much harder to ignore. A reputation not built by headlines, but by volume. What's striking is how consistent the language becomes across these accounts. Not dramatic villainy, not cartoonish cruelty, but a steady sense of being talked down to, of being treated as disposable, of being made to feel small. And in an industry where most people already feel replaceable, that kind of behavior cuts deep. Then there is the question of longevity. Fame, especially at this level, usually follows one of two paths. Either it evolves into legacy, or it burns out quietly. And lately, the signs point toward something closer to the latter. The energy has shifted. The cultural relevance feels reduced. The enthusiasm from audiences feels muted. And while that could be attributed to changing tastes, it's difficult to ignore how closely it aligns with the growing awareness of his reputation. Hollywood has an unspoken rule. You can be difficult if you are irreplaceable. You can be demanding if you are legendary. But if you are merely popular, merely useful, merely convenient, patience runs thin, especially when newer, less controversial options exist. And that is the danger zone where many believe he now stands. Attempts at reframing the narrative have been visible. Emphasis on personal growth, on change, on lessons learned, on a new chapter. Sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. People do change, but systems also protect. And the line between accountability and rehabilitation is often blurry. What makes this story linger is not outrage, but discomfort, because it forces a larger question about how fame works, who it rewards, and how long behavior can be overlooked when success keeps flowing. It also forces audiences to confront their own role. The clips we share, the moments we ignore, the laughter we offer even when something feels off. By now, you may feel conflicted. That's intentional, because the most compelling stories rarely offer clean conclusions. They offer mirrors. And what you see in this one depends on what you value more: talent, charm, accountability, or kindness. So here is where I turn it over to you. If you made it this far, you are part of the conversation. I want you to scroll down and do 3 things. First, comment the moment in this story that changed how you felt, even slightly. Second, share your perspective on whether power reveals character or creates it. And third, if you want more deep dives like this, type the word hype in the comments so I know there's demand. That's how you help shape what comes next. Because stories like this are not just about celebrities. They are about systems, about silence, about what we tolerate and why, and whether we're finally reaching a point where reputation matters as much as ratings. If you stayed until the end, you already know this wasn't just gossip. It was a case study. And the real ending isn't written yet.